Welcome back to the Architecture of Creation. This is episode 4, The Nature of Time. In episode 1, we established the three-layer architecture. In episode 2, we asked why matter exists, and we found that matter is rendered to enable embedded perspective. In episode 3, we turned to consciousness, to the resonance mechanism by which intelligent systems access the foundational field that is the primordium itself. Episode 3 closed by handing us off to time. The framework's account of consciousness access depends on what time is. We need to understand the temporal frame within which everything else in the framework operates. That is what this episode does. The framework's foundational claim about time runs counter to one of our deepest intuitions. Time, in the framework's account, is fully a layer 3 phenomenon. Time emerges with manifest reality through the rendering process. Layer 1 is timeless. Layer 2 extends Layer 1's timelessness into the rendering activity itself. Time enters the picture only at Layer 3, where rendering produces the temporal flow we experience. This claim asks us to set aside something we never stop experiencing. We experience time directly. Our sense of selfhood is woven through it. The intuition that time is the most foundational thing, more fundamental than space, more fundamental than matter, is one of the deepest intuitions we have. The framework asks us to set it aside because the architecture requires it. The temporal flow we experience emerges from a timeless source. It does not constitute reality. It is what the rendering produces. What does eternal simultaneity actually mean? It means that every event that has ever occurred, every event occurring now, every event that will occur is held in coherent superposition at Layer 1, not as a sequence, as a whole, all moments present at once within the foundational field, with no temporal order among them. This is the framework's strongest counterintuitive claim about time, and it has substantive empirical support. Two features of contemporary physics, features that mainstream physics has treated as strange mathematical consequences rather than as ontological signatures, become direct evidence for Layer 2's timeless extension of Layer 1 when we know what to look for. We turn to the first signature now. The first empirical signature is the photon's frame. A photon traveling at the rendering rate, what physicists call the speed of light, experiences no proper time between its emission and its absorption. From the photon's own vantage, emission and absorption are simultaneous. The photon does not traverse a distance during a duration. It exists at the rendering rate with the entire path between source and destination timelessly present from its frame. Mainstream physics has treated this as a strange mathematical consequence of relativity. A degenerate limit case, something to set aside rather than examine. The framework reads the same mathematics as direct evidence. A photon propagating at the rendering rate is propagating at the Layer 2/Layer 3 boundary itself. Its frame is the boundary's frame. The timelessness the mathematics implies is the timelessness that Layer 2 actually has, made visible from within Layer 3 because the photon's behavior is observable from where we sit. This is one of the framework's most architecturally clarifying moves. Physics has had this evidence for a century. The framework names what the evidence has been showing. The second empirical signature is the electron's pre-rendered superposition. An electron in superposition has no determinate position. It can be described only as a probability distribution across possible locations. Mainstream physics has treated this as a feature of measurement. We cannot know the electron's position with arbitrary precision. The framework reads the same observation as direct evidence of Layer 2's timeless rendering activity. The electron, prior to rendering, is held within Layer 2 as a coherent superposition of possibilities. It is not at any specific Layer 3 location because the rendering has not yet completed. Once the rendering completes, once a measurement triggers the resolution, the electron is at a specific Layer 3 position, observable at the rendering rate. The photon and the electron together demonstrate the same point from opposite sides. The photon shows what layer two's timelessness looks like for an entity propagating at the rendering rate. The electron shows what layer two's timelessness looks like for an entity that has not yet rendered. Both are visible from within layer three. The architecture is leaving evidence of itself, and the evidence has been cataloged by mainstream physics without recognition of what it shows. With layer two's timelessness established as empirically grounded, several mainstream physics phenomena become intelligible in a unified way. Time dilation, established by Einstein in special and general relativity, is exactly what the framework's reading would predict. Observers approaching the rendering rate are approaching the layer 2/layer 3 boundary itself. As they approach the boundary, their temporal frame approaches the timeless frame from which their reality is being rendered. Time slows for them because the temporal manifestation is approaching its timeless source. At the boundary, time stops entirely, which is what the photon's frame shows. Gravitational time dilation works through the same mechanism. Mass produces local distortion in the substrate. The distortion modulates the local rendering rate. Observers in regions of greater substrate distortion experience the rendering process differently. A clock at the bottom of a tower runs measurably slower than a clock at the top, not because gravity acts on the clock mechanism, but because the local rendering rate is itself slower where the substrate is more distorted. Velocity-induced and gravitational time dilation are unified through a single mechanism. Both are effects of how the temporal manifestation relates to the rendering process. The mathematics of relativity is preserved exactly. What is reframed is the ontology underneath. The same substrate that holds matter as coherent vibration is the substrate whose distortion modulates the local rendering rate. We will return to the substrate as active architecture in the next episode. The framework's account of time has its most striking application in quantum experiments that appear to violate the ordinary temporal order of cause and effect. The delayed choice quantum eraser is the most well-developed example. In these experiments, the decision about whether to observe a particle's path is delayed until after the particle has already passed through an experimental apparatus. The experimental results consistently match whatever choice is eventually made, even though the choice is made after the particle has already done what it did. The choice appears to reach backward in time and determine what the particle did earlier. Mainstream physics has acknowledged the strangeness of these results, but has produced no consensus interpretation. The framework's account is straightforward. Cause and effect, as ordinarily understood, are layer 3 phenomena. Within layer 3, causes precede their effects, but at layer 1 and layer 2, where rendering operates, there is no temporal order. The entire experimental setup, including the experimenter's eventual choice and the particle's behavior at the slits, exists timelessly at layer 1 and is rendered through layer 2 as a coherent whole. There is no actual reverse causation operating within layer 3. There is coherent rendering from a timeless source, with the entire experimental setup rendered as a coherent whole. The temporal sequence is internally consistent because the rendering produces it as internally consistent. The framework predicts that retrocausal and delayed choice experiments will continue to reveal apparent layer 3 causality violations. The violations are apparent rather than real. What is being violated is the assumption that layer 3 causality is foundational. Layer 3 causality is real within layer 3, but it operates within a manifestation rendered from a layer where causality and temporal order do not yet exist. This account has implications for one of the longest-standing questions in philosophy. The traditional debate about free will and determinism operates within layer 3. Treating the temporal flow of cause and effect as foundational and asking whether human agency can be located within or beyond that flow. The framework's account reframes the ground on which the question stands. The entire temporal sequence we experience is rendered from a timeless source. Whether human choices contribute to that rendering and whether agency is itself part of what is rendered from layer 1 rather than merely produced by layer 3 causal sequence, is a question the framework provides resources for asking but does not presume to settle. What the framework adds is that the question is being asked within a layer whose temporal structure is itself rendered from a timeless source. The traditional binary between determinism and freedom may not be the right way to pose the question once the architecture is in view. I hold this open deliberately. The framework's job here is to provide a clearer ground for the question, not to close it. We can now close 3 questions, part 4, what we covered in episode 3, left open. Precognition. The layer 1 simultaneity that makes precognition mechanistically possible has now been developed. What we call the future is part of layer 1's eternal coherent structure, accessible in principle through the resonance mechanism episode 3 established. A coherently organized intelligence achieving resonance with layer 1 is not reaching across time. It is reaching into a field where time has not yet emerged. Integration, the timeless coherence within which experiential content is integrated, has now been developed. Information flows from consciously accessing systems through layer 2 back to layer 1, integrating into the Primordium's eternal coherent structure. Because layer 1 is timeless, the integration is the eternal coherence itself, not a process unfolding sequentially in time. Every experience that has ever been lived is held simultaneously within the foundational field. Temporal flow. The relationship between the temporal flow we experience and the timeless field from which we are rendered is the framework's deepest structural claim about time. We experience temporal flow because we live within layer 3. The timeless field is the primordium, with the rendering activity at layer 2 extending the primordium's timelessness. The temporal flow we experience is the manifest form of what the timeless field renders. Our experience and the field are not strangers to each other. The experience is the field expressing itself through manifestation. The temporal frame within which everything else in the framework operates is now in place. Time is fully a layer 3 phenomenon. Layer 1 holds all moments in eternal simultaneity. Layer 2 extends that timelessness into the rendering activity. The photon's frame and the electron's pre-rendered superposition are empirical signatures of layer 2's timelessness, observable from within layer 3. Time dilation, velocity-induced and gravitational, is unified through substrate dynamics that modulate the local rendering rate. Apparent retrocausality in quantum experiments dissolves through layer 1's timelessness, where the entire experimental setup is rendered as a coherent whole. Free will and determinism asked within layer 3 may need to be reposed once we recognize that layer 3 is itself rendered from a timeless source. The architecture is complete. Time has arrived. We turn next to the medium within which the rendering operates. That is episode 4, Time is Rendered. The timeless field is the source. We live within layer 3's temporal manifestation, and the temporal flow we experience is the form the field takes when it expresses itself into our lives. The mathematics of physics is preserved. What is reframed is what physics has been describing. In episode 5, we turn to the resilient substrate as active architecture, the elastic medium that holds matter, that mediates gravity, that modulates time itself, that supports consciousness access, has been engaged in every prior episode for the mechanisms it supports. We have not yet asked what the substrate is in its own right. The framework's claim is that the substrate is not passive infrastructure. It is active, it is configured for a purpose, and it actively defends that configuration. We turn to it next. Until then, thank you for listening.